Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Skies of Thunder, the deadly World War II mission over the roof of the world, is a little-known story of the Allies' fight in World War II's chaotic and lethal China-Burma-India theatre. It's a fascinating new book by Caroline Alexander, and I'm very glad to say that Caroline Alexander joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Now, this is an area of the Second World War that perhaps many people are unaware of. So you could argue the Second World War started with China and Japan some, 3 or 4 years before Germany invades Poland in 1939.
Yes. And this is certainly the view that the Chinese had. They felt they had been fighting the common enemy off camera, as it were, before the war gets up and going. This is a very convoluted theatre. I can try and paint it in very broad strokes, if that's useful.
It will do, because a lot of people won't know what on earth is going on and what the situation is with China.
Well, first of all, the theatre was a sort of an American sub-theatre within the British India-Burma theatre, and with administrative confusion. It was known as the China-Burma-India Theatre, or CBI, which within weeks the men on the ground were saying stood for confusion beyond imagination. So that should encapsulate it at the outset. The basic premise was America driven, which was President Roosevelt believed that China, which at this time is, I won't say firmly under the control of Chiang Kai-shek, but apparently, ostensibly under the role of Chiang Kai-shek, or more than any other competing warlord at any rate. And he believed that after the war, China would fill the void that would be left by the fall of the European empires, and specifically the British Empire in the East. And therefore, if America cultivated China, there would be this strong partnership going forward after the war, and undoubtedly a very handy trading partner, hundreds of millions of potential consumers of American goods. And so Roosevelt looked really only over the war horizon. And this is what makes this theatre perhaps unique, in that it was almost politically driven more than militarily necessary. So all activities after that are directed by the political need to appease Chiang Kai-shek and China more than by any military strategy.
And this just goes to show how America has the interest of that particular part of the world very much front and center. We know there's obviously Americans in the Philippines, because that's been going on for a while. But for those who say, if you say American influence, they think, okay, domino theory, Vietnam, Indochina, all that area, Laos, Cambodia. But this predates this, and it just shows, and it's been ignored pretty much by a lot of historians about how much the States was backing Chiang Kai-shek, and up until, if you're talking about great promises broken and not kept, well, the Western allies, particularly Americans' promises to Chiang Kai-shek that they would really help China in their fight against Japanese imperialism. I mean, that was soon, as soon as the events of sort of 43, 44 happened, was you could argue that was soon sort of put on the back burner.
Yes. Well, there's several sort of interesting conditions. The first, just by way of background, is that remarkably at this time, through the 20s and 30s, America had a very strong missionary presence in China. There were a remarkable number of Chinese-speaking Americans through this missionary network. And I was struck by the fact, just anecdotally, that the first of the pilots who died in the air mission, over the roof of the world, was exactly one of these children of missionaries and spoke Chinese. Just a small little data point, that this random person would have this connection. So there was very much this popular interest in China, but idealized interest. And so the vision was that China would emerge after the war as this kind of democratic Christian nation that would be hand in glove with America going forward. So that was, first of all, the kind of foundation on which Roosevelt had to build, with the promise of, it's very vague, the promise was to help Japan, but all American intelligence at this time was revealing that there was no active front within China, or at least on the nationalist troops, actually fighting the Japanese. The Japanese have pretty much occupied all the coastal areas, all the, if one could say, places of interest. The Chinese people have been heroic in their stoicism and patience and suffering and improvisation and so forth. But in terms of the military under the command of Chiang Kai-shek, very, very little was happening. And this was reported on waves of missions, waves of inquiries sent over. And Roosevelt sort of waved these away because he wasn't interested in the military situation. He was interested in keeping China stable, Chiang Kai-shek in place, no more problems happening while the war was sort of fought, deal with all that later. But after the war, we would have this great ally in America. And then what happens is that much of the promised goods that were flown over, which is the backbone of my story, is the airlift, this remarkable airlift to China. Much of these get diverted, some considerable portion to the black market, and the other sort of squabbled over by two American generals. And at the end of it, it's very hard to say, what China, in the big, capital letters, actually got out of it.
And then, of course, we have land lease to the Soviet Union as well that comes in, which also diverts an awful lot of the promised goods to China. The Japanese Imperial Army makes light, mobile, fast, makes huge gains, crushing the empire. Because this war, you can see from an Asian point of view, is the end of a colonial empire. At least as far as it goes to the British, the French is another kettle of fish. However, and so very quickly, Singapore, Burma, basically all the way up into the border with India. They make tremendous advances, the Japanese, and that cuts off a supply route. So there is only one way to help the Chinese and get goods to people, and this is where this quite incredible story comes in, because it is a frightening and daunting prospect to fly the Himalayas.
Yes. So the supply route, such as it was, had been the Burma Road, and that is the legendary Burma Road, and that was what was cut off with this rapid Japanese advance all the way up through Burma, and had from Rangoon, which is where the supplies came in. So now China is very much blockaded. And the idea is since the coast is locked in with Japanese occupation, land routes are claimed, the only way left is by air. And Roosevelt makes a pledge. He says, I want to say to the brave people of China that no matter what it takes, America sort of will be there to supply you. And this is the origin of the air route, which led from sort of the closest dropping off, takeoff point, if you will, which was in northeast India in Assam, which would eventually evolve into a multitude, some 20 sort of small and large air bases, American-run air bases, that would fly over the foothills of the Himalayas to Kunching, China, which is in the southwest of China. In Yunnan province, very wild and undeveloped part of China, which was already relatively undeveloped. And so this was on paper, looked like a very tidy little line. If you draw it just as little arrows on the map, it looks quite straightforward. It's only about 800 miles. But there were many, many complications which were known, and this is where pilots can get quite angry. It wasn't as if this all was discovered after the fact. And one of the facts is that this is a very perilous needle. It's like threading a needle through the mountain peaks of the Himalayas. From our point of view now, from modern aviation, I flew over to England just about a week ago, and I think we flew at something like 44,000 feet. The aircraft at this time had ceilings in the 20,000s.
Right.
And so So 26 is pushing it empty, but the sort of cruising altitude is more like 17,000, 18,000 feet. The highest peak, I hope I don't get too sort of down in the weeds with all this, but it's sort of what I'm trying to visualize. But the highest peak of the actual route, which came to be flying the hump, over the hump of the Himalayas, was only about 14,500 feet, 15,000 feet. But the problem was you had to be quite exact on your route to get that exact clear path. And all around you, when you looked out the window, were peaks higher than you were flying.
Oh.
And now we come to the second, which was, in fact, larger than the terrain, which is the weather. And there is, in fact, if you recall, I think it was it the end of last year, there was an incident, an air incident, modern aviation, commercial airline that dropped thousands of feet out of the sky, and people were very badly injured. That's probably part of the same chronic system, which is now generally overflown because one can get at altitude and go over it. But what you have at this sort of the point where the aircraft have to pass through was this unholy convergence of different air systems. You had these warm, moist highs from the Bay of Bengal, South China Sea, and then you had this kind of frigid, chronic Arctic blast coming down from the Tibetan plateau, and they all roil together and create against the Himalayas what pilots today in terminology is called mountain wave effect. And this is where you can experience it if you fly over, ranges today. And so these aircraft were driven wildly off course with very primitive navigation aids. And so this is where those peaks and this threading the needle path becomes so critical.
And what are they flying? Is it DC-3s mainly?
They're flying initially the beloved DC-3, which was known as the Dakota in Britain. The DC-3 had been a commercial airline built in the US and had flown. I think its capacity at that time was about 22 passengers, which again, to give you a sense of how small this was. And this was considered the largest sort of cargo plane, available. But it was a very steady aircraft. Another thing to just point out, its cruising speed is about 175 knots. The wind speeds encountered were often of that same speed, and on one terrible night, much fiercer. So the aircraft are plodding along, burning a lot of fuel on the one hand, but a steady and forgiving plane. And then, and this was known in military parlance as the C-47. And then a new aircraft were brought in to attempt to sort of hustle things over quicker with much larger carrying capacities. And this began to complicate the already very difficult task. So when the C-46 comes in, which is larger, it also comes in and is an untested aircraft. It's actually tested over the Himalayas. Every weakness that it has was found by the weather conditions, by the humidity around, by the ice above, and so forth. This became, I think the pilots became as afraid of the plane as they were of the actual route.
And who's flying these? This is presumably a volunteer thing, because is this where we get, is it the Flying Tigers? It's not the Screaming Eagles. Is it the Flying Tigers come from here, or is it the Screaming Eagles? I'm trying to remember. It's an American situation, but it's a nickname that's still, I think they're still going to go on the Flying Tigers as cargo.
The Flying Tigers, the Flying Tigers are not, take a quick diversion from the hump.
Right.
The Flying Tigers was a group. Their official name was the American Volunteer Group, the AVG. Interestingly, if you research them from Britain, they're called the International Volunteer Group, the IVG. And this has led to some complications in relating their history as to sort of who they were. That's pedantic, but it's useful if one's trying to sort of follow them. And they were a group of volunteers who were mostly incentivized by the remarkably high pay and the pledge that they would be given bonuses for every Japanese aircraft they shot down. They were under the command of General Claire Lee Chennault, who was had never ever been in combat, never ever been close to combat, never would be in combat, had been retired out of the Air Force for health reasons and deafness. And when he came over to China to help build up the Chinese Air Force, one of many attempts that were actually made, he had was under his health and precariousness as a pilot was so bad that he had been disallowed from flying solo. He could only fly under supervision. The American media factory got to work and greatly aided by Chenault's claims. In his memoir, he says that his group of trusted, daring pilots shot down, I think he claims, 330 confirmed kills, but he speculates and prints that they're up to 600. And this is what he tells Roosevelt, by the way, 600. Mm-hmm. In fact, there were about 114, and he lost 86 of his 100 aircraft. So the ratio was not particularly good, but it made a very good story. And a legend you're living with is a result of the media, not of reality.
How much of a threat was the Japanese Air Force then, or was it mainly the actual terrain itself? Because I imagine that you don't want to be trying to tackle Dakotas or whatever in a zero in somewhere sort of north of Tibet or south of Tibet. So presumably the main danger comes from the actual flying conditions themselves rather than enemy action.
The Flying Tigers are a sidebar, and I want to underscore this. They originally were sold to Roosevelt as sort of going to fight and save China. In the event, one of the things that Chenault had claimed was that there are 120 airfields all over China in excellent condition. This was untrue. And when the aircraft were finally delivered, they ended up sitting in Burma because there were no airfields ready to receive them in China. So they never, in fact, defended China, but they did make a presence, a very welcome presence, over Burma as Rangoon was falling. But then after that, they sort of fade from history.
I've only got 5 minutes left. I can talk to you at the end of the day about this. So let's get some ones out of the way. Wingate's, right, two of my favourite groups because of the names. Wingate's Chindits and, of course, Merrill's Marauders. Now, I've known the Chindits, I've in the history of the legendary Chindits for years. So just briefly explain what those two groups have to do with this particular story.
Wingate was I suppose, visionary British officer with a very interesting past that we won't go into, but it's fair to say his speciality was guerrilla warfare and thinking outside of the box. He was both admired greatly by the men he led and despised by many of his superior officers who felt that his whole guerrilla force was sort of operating without supervision. But his insight, he made some remarkable insights, and one of them was that this idea of what he called long-range penetration, which was that you train men to live in the jungle and operate behind Japanese lines. They were never intended to be a kind of infantry artillery force or anything like that. They weren't assault troops.
Yeah.
They were guerrilla troops that would cut lines of communication, cause confusion. And in his view, he was very focused that the idea was to cause so much confusion that the enemy had to change their plans so that they were disrupted from doing what they had prepared to do. But in the second there were two Chindit operations, and the second one is the one that really concerns my book, because American air power was given to him by the American Air Force Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Henry Arnold, a remarkably innovative man, as innovative as Wingate, who said, you know what, I'm going to give you 100 aircraft of every variety, even helicopters, and two American officers, and they will be your part of your team. And this allowed Wingate to be supplied in the jungle, because this was the whole point, was that the Chindits were self-sufficient. And I think that the role of the this Air Force has been very much edited out of the Chindit story, not in the memoirs written by the actual Chindits, who go out of their way to praise this group that was called the Number One Air Commando, but in later histories they tend to be written as a sidebar, and yet they really were the heart and soul of the whole enterprise.
I've only got 2 minutes. I'm really, when you come to writing this story, are you primary sources, presumably? I mean, that's got to be the yes. one thing. So how do you get the primary sources? The logs must be fascinating, and the reports, the diaries must be sort of teeth-clenchingly sort of dramatic.
They are all of that. The material was overwhelming the volume of it, for one thing. First of all, the U.S. Army Air Forces, as they were then known, has troves and troves and troves of documents, and thousands of, I would order these, and they'd, send the reels over, and it'd sort of be thousands of pages of documents coming, and my eyes would glaze, but very, very useful for getting granular incidents and also reports from pilots. But there was also, I was very determined from the outset to sort of to contextualize this. And there were many memoirs, say, for example, from tea planters in Assam who were not military, but they helped set the scene and set the stage. And memoirs from Chinese missionaries, and memoirs from all range of different types of people. Some of the hill tribes, so-called hill tribes of what was then known as Burma, now Myanmar, wrote some memoirs also that are very little known. So you get all these voices from the different, not just to quote, but just to get background. And so this was all thrilling and varied. It was never just one story, one version after the other. But at the heart of it are these pilots' reminiscences. And some of these had been self-published by the sons and daughters of pilots who discovered that their father had left a diary about something he never talked about. Those are where you get these harrowing, incredible stories of aviation, of planes being turned upside down by wind vortexes and blown, hundreds and hundreds of miles off course, and traveling blind on instruments, from takeoff to landing.
It's an incredible story, and I'm going to run out of time, unfortunately. So, listeners, I urge you to go to the TRE Virtual Bookstore and order the book. The book is called Skies of Thunder, the deadly World War II mission over the roof of the world. Caroline, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.